Why is history repeating in Kenya? 1 year ago, thousands took to the streets of Nairobi protesting against new tax laws, government corruption, and police brutality. 60 people died. A year later, nothing much has changed. The streets of the Kenyan capital again filled with demonstrators, tear gas, and gunshots. Amnesty International says 16 more people died on Wednesday, mostly killed by the police. But each civilian life lost is strengthening the call among Kenyans for justice, as DW correspondent Sella Oneko reports from Nairobi.
Young Kenyans are protesting on the streets again, and once more, they're angry at the death of one of their own. They say at the hands of the authorities. This time, it's Albert Ojwang's name they're calling. He was a teacher and blogger who was arrested for publishing supposedly false claims about the deputy police chief and found dead in his police cell. Watching Ojwang's father on TV is a horror for Jillian Munyao and Crispin Odawa. Their son Rex was shot and killed at a protest a year ago.
Sometimes I watch whatever is happening on TV there. My tears always comes.
It's so painful that we are trying to heal, then come another bombshell of Ojwang.
Rex Masai Kanyike was the first person to die during last year's so-called Gen Z protests against a controversial finance bill. Local news outlets showed CCTV footage of a crowd running from the police and a man thought to be a plainclothes officer shooting a handgun. Rex's parents show us where he died.
You could trace the blood from where he was.
From where he was shot.
There, to this place. Then some, when they were crossing the road.
Boniface Mwangi, a prominent activist, arrived at the clinic that evening and found Rex's family and friends standing over his body.
It unlocked emotions that I've never had before. And then we had to be there for the family. We organized a fundraiser for the family. And we thought Rex was the first and the last person to be shot. And then a couple of days later, on June 25th, the government killed more people.
Rex's death became integrated into the protests. They grew, and eventually people stormed the parliament building. That's when security forces fired on them. Kenya's police watchdog IPOA is investigating 60 deaths and 233 injuries connected to police conduct during the 2024 protests. Criticized for being ineffective and intransparent, IPOA says the police often do not cooperate.
For example, an incident may happen near a police station, or there's a demonstration in a county or somewhere else, and somebody is killed. Who was issued which gun? Those are very basic information that you require before you even start investigations. But the law says the officer of the police station needs to cooperate.
There are some signs of consequences. 6 men, including 3 police officers, are now facing murder charges in connection with Albert Ojwang's death, and Kenya's deputy police chief has stepped aside while an investigation is underway. But the violence is not stopping. During protests against Ojwang's death, DW cameras caught the shooting of a young vendor in the head on video. 2 police officers were arrested as a result.
The police officer who did that particular shooting was masking his face. That's even illegal. So a lot of illegality. So as a protester, you have to know that when you go to the streets, you're going to deal with goons, militia, and police officers disguised in goons' clothes or civilian clothes.
The National Police Service denies working with such groups. Rex's case is one of only 2 of the 60 deaths from last year to make it to an official inquest in court. Rex's parents and other families had hoped for police support to commemorate the anniversary of last year's deaths.
We want to plant flowers for our fallen heroes. We want to have prayers for our kids to mark that 1 year down the line.
And march she did. On the 25th of June, thousands of people took to the streets around Kenya. They were met with tear gas and force. As the day progressed, reports of fatalities came in, as well as injuries from gunshots, beatings, and people caught up in the scuffles. We're here at a medical camp that's been set up in the middle of town, and since we've been here, we've seen several ambulances and also people on motorbikes being ferried to the tents to be attended by the medics. The medics themselves say that they have come under tear gas and water cannons that have been fired into this area.
This is a very sad situation because this is a place where people are coming for refuge. They should leave this place alone, and I would want to request that the government should just choose to listen to its people.
With reports of more deaths, arrests and injuries, Kenya is holding its breath for the days to come.
My colleague Edith Kimani has been closely following the protests in Kenya and joins me now from Nairobi. Hello, Edith. Good to see you. Now, a year ago, protests began over a controversial finance bill, but it has evolved into something much bigger, hasn't it?
That's right, Eddie. I would say that the three main things that young Kenyans are advocating for right now start with justice. There are 60 people who died last year in similar protests, and their families, unfortunately, still do not know who was behind them, and they have not been held accountable. And so that's a primary wound that Kenyans are trying to have healed. The second thing is accountability. This is a country that, on the one hand, announces austerity measures, meaning that critical financing for sectors like healthcare and education are now not being met, and at the same time are announcing funding for renovations of State House, which is where the president resides. And so young people seeing things like this are taking to the streets saying that they just don't want that. And in general, they want better systems for the nation.
Right. And one of the major concerns, obviously, are police brutalities that's been going on for quite some time now. But it's also about abductions of government critics. How widespread is that?
Extremely widespread. In fact, at some point at the beginning of the year and last year, it had become almost mainstay where you wake up every morning and you see names of people who are missing, who have allegedly been disappeared by the state. And there's a report which was released earlier this year by Amnesty International together with a consortium of rights groups. And they say that last year alone, 55 people went through enforced disappearances. Now, that number might seem like it's just little, but it represents over 100% increase of the same number of abductions last year. And so very much are concerned, not just for government critics, but even those who are criticizing the government on social media. One of the most famous cases was of a young gentleman called Kibet, who disappeared for a few days after he generated AI images of the president looking as though he was in a coffin.
Right. And obviously recently Albert Ojwang, who was basically abducted and died in police custody, which has also led to recent protests. But as you said earlier, more than 60 deaths linked to police violence last year, yet only 2 in court. Isn't it taking too long, Edith?
Absolutely. And the Independent Policing and Oversight Authority, who is a body mandated to basically be in charge of police behavior here, say that they are doing their job, that 2 cases have made it to court, but they've completed investigations on over 30 cases. And they place the blame squarely on the Director of Public Prosecutions here in Kenya, saying that he needs to bring these matters to court and the court now needs to then set in motion. But the judicial process here in Kenya is extremely slow. One court case can take up to 4 or maybe even 5 years before it is mentioned in a court. And so it's expected that the cases that unraveled last year, those people who died, but not be able to get justice for a very, very long time.
Right. So how has President Ruto responded to these events of the past year?
His critics will definitely say that he is completely disconnected and that he has buried his head in the sand. On the issue of abductions, earlier in the year, he said that everybody who had been abducted has gone back home. But if you ask the families of those who are still missing, they will say absolutely not. He's also made certain promises to make sure that justice is indeed found for those who lost their loved ones. But again, if you ask those who lost their loved ones, they'll say that it's just happening a little too slowly. However, if you ask the people who support President Ruto, he'll say that everything that's happening in the country is distracting him from doing the job that he's supposed to be doing, that it's a bit of a chicken and egg situation, that if the protests stop, he'll be able to do his job. But the protesters are saying he's not doing his job, and that's why they're back on the streets.
Right, and the cycle continues. It seems to be the cycle of protesting, killings, then more protests and killings. How does this end, Edith? What's the way forward?
Oof, I think this is a question that Kenyans will be asking and trying to answer for a very long time. But today, the most pressing issue is justice. People were killed during protests last year. They were killed again during the protests this year. And their families need answers, and so does the general public. They also want an overhaul of the system. They want things to change. The bloated governments need to end. They want funding, or rather spending, that isn't checked to also stop. And that might change things for the people here in Kenya.
Right. Edith Kimani, DW correspondent in Nairobi, Kenya. Thank you and stay safe.
Thank you.